expansion conditions, and the second is to discuss compelling public interest. This continues to build on a platform of the passage of the Environmental Justice Law, the nation's first, on September 18, 2020. As you may be aware, this law does not go into effect until we adopt rules, and today's discussion is a continuation of the process that gets us to rule completion. If you missed our initial meeting or any of the previous stakeholder meetings and need any of that context, you can find this information on our Office of Environmental Justice website at nj.gov/DEP/EJ. So please note that this meeting is only one step of consistent points of engagement in our rulemaking. We'll continue to have further discussions after today, so we welcome your engagement on an ongoing basis. Can we go to the next slide, please? So just some things for consideration. First, if you need live captions for this recording, this is the way that you can pursue it. There are 3 dots in the bar that are going across the top of the screen. If you click on those 3 dots, the ellipses, you will see one of the options that shows up, which says turn on live captions. You can click on that, and then you will see live captions show up at the bottom of the Teams window. Please also note at this point that recording has officially begun. And by participating in this meeting and realizing that recording is going on, you are giving consent to being present if you in fact speak on the public record. Once this recording is done, it will be posted on the Office of Environmental Justice website, so it will be available to the public. With regard to our agenda for today, I'm going to go over the rules of engagement. We'll talk about implementation, limitations, and a 4-step potential process. We'll discuss permit conditions, compelling public interest, and as usual, we will do all we can to leave time for questions and answers at the end. Of course, if you do have questions as we're proceeding, do feel free to raise your hand, and at the opportune moment, we will recognize your hands in the order that they were received. To raise your hand, there is an emoji at the top with a hand that looks like this. If you hover over that, you'll see one of the options is a hand. You click on that, and with that, you can raise your hand. You can also submit comments in our chat or questions in the chat as well. And that is what looks like the little comic speaking circle. And so if you click on that, it will open up the chat function for you, and you can type in a comment or a question. Please do note that as we proceed through the course of these conversations, we usually give immediate responses to questions. For comments, we'll give notice that we see it there and it's there for the record. But if there isn't any substantive feedback for us to give to a comment, we're just going to address questions because we want to ensure we spend this time giving clarification to any inquiries that are out there. And just as a heads up, we want you to be aware we're planning our next stakeholder meeting on May 6, 2021, with the topics of environmental justice impact statements and the permitting process. And as usual, we'll have our 10 a.m. with business and industry and an evening meeting with environmental justice and community organizations. And again, this presentation and the meeting recording are posted all on our Office of Environmental Justice website. We'll also have a survey there, so we look forward to any additional feedback you have. Next slide, please. So these are our rules of engagement for today. Please remain on mute unless you are speaking. It is so important. There are a lot of people on this call. The last I looked, we're at 100 now. So it is very important to stay on mute unless you're actually the person who's speaking at that moment. It gives us a good quality recording, and it's not a distraction. We want to be really focused and be productive in the time that we have set aside. So we already talked about how we use the raise hand function. We want to treat everyone with respect, and really we want to limit comments or questions on the topic being discussed today. Please note that we're trying to just allocate 2 minutes for everyone to have an opportunity to speak today, and you will physically see me raise my hand like this when you've approached 90 seconds, just so we're mindful of the time and we give everyone who wants to speak an opportunity to do so. And again, underscoring that the meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the Office of Environmental Justice website when the session concludes. The next slide, please. Since we're about halfway through our stakeholder meetings at this point, I just wanted to use this as an opportunity to reiterate our guiding principles at the DEP. These are the principles that guide us. Number 1, to follow the law. Number 2, to use the best available science. Number 3, to listen to all sides. Number 4, find the best balance. And number 5, to be transparent and honest with the public. So these are the principles that we have in mind here as a department, and we ask that as we continue to engage in these discussions, that we apply these principles with our stakeholders as well. So in our past discussions, we've already touched upon geographic points of comparison, facility and permit definitions, and environmental and public health stressors. Today, again, for those of you who may have come on late, we're going to talk about conditions for renewal and expansion, as well as compelling public interest. And just looking ahead, for May 6th, we're going to discuss environmental justice impact statements and process, and that will be followed by a meeting in June to do a summary and an overview of everything it is that we have discussed so far over the course of these stakeholder meetings. Okay. So in terms of the limitations, please note that the law does not require absolute denial of environmental permits for new facilities. The bill does not allow DEP to deny facility expansions or permit renewals. The law requires an analysis of localized public health and environmental impacts and an analysis of additional controls that can be put in place to reduce localized pollution as conditions to any permit. And again, that this law is not effective until the rules, the regulations have been adopted. Next slide, please. So at this time, before getting into the potential process of 4 steps, I want to hand the floor over to my colleague, Sean Moriarty, who is the Chief Advisor for Regulatory Affairs here at the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. So Sean, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Olivia. Thank you so much. And good morning to everyone. As Olivia said, we are back for round 4 of our stakeholder process and only a few more to go. We're starting to kind of round the curve towards the end of this thing. And we really are deeply grateful for everyone's continued engagement here on these very important topics. As Olivia talked about, today we're going to discuss renewal and expansion conditions as well as compelling public interest. And as we've tried to do moving through here is to provide as much context as possible to these discussions so folks can understand how these things might fit in. So we're offering in that vein kind of a 4-step high-level preliminary potential process of what this could look like. And we'll talk primarily about steps 3 and 4 today, but I think it's important to understand how they might fit into a broader process. So in that vein, step 1 would be an initial screening process where we would use that publicly available data in the mapping tool that we've talked about previously that lists all of the overburdened communities with the addition of the stressor layers that we discussed last time, determine whether that specific overburdened community is subject to disproportionate environmental and public health stressor levels when compared to the appropriate geographic unit of comparison. So again, that requires some final decisions on our part, but does cover a lot of the topics that we've already walked through as part of this stakeholder process. Once that step has been completed, step 2 would essentially be a disproportionate impact analysis. And that would be through the environmental justice impact statement process, including that required public hearing in the host community. An applicant would analyze whether and how the proposed facility work will cause or contribute to disproportionate stressor levels and propose avoidance measures to prevent that cause or contribution. If that cannot be prevented, then a disproportionate impact would exist. when we move past that, we get into questions of permitting, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Primarily with permit conditions, so that would be limited to facility expansions and Title V renewals or major air source renewals. So that would require an applicant, where necessary to avoid those or minimize those potential impacts. There would be binding conditions placed in those permits concerning the construction and operation of the facility. So that's in a situation where the impacts of the facility are unavoidable. There would be additional measures put in place to protect public health that would affect the operation and construction of the facility. For new facilities, this is a very specific thing for new facilities, the law provides that we would deny the permit unless that new facility would serve a compelling public interest in the community, with emphasis on in the community. In a situation where the department might consider a compelling public interest, the department would impose similar binding permit conditions on the construction operation of the facility to protect public health and ultimately improve the baseline environmental and public health conditions in the host community. So I think what's important to note here is a through line through several of these steps, which is a process of avoidance of impacts. That can take a couple of different, potentially take a couple of different forms. One primarily, and I think most clearly, is a facility taking all appropriate steps to minimize its impacts from its own operations. And that could include additional control technologies on its direct emissions. It could include electrification of equipment and other things on site that would reduce its contributions to the impacts in the overburdened community. Beyond that, and things that we need to discuss as part of this conversation are whether there is an appropriate place to consider like-kind reductions from other sources in the community, non-like-kind reductions for other sources in the community, or ultimately the provision of something that could be considered a net environmental benefit to the community. Again, focused on the specific community where that facility is sought to be sited. And those concepts, we're going to talk about them throughout today. I think that we have not yet decided exactly where or how those might fit in, whether they're appropriate and how we might include them in this process. They could potentially be included in a disproportionate impact analysis, as well as included as part of a permit conditioning or a compelling public interest analysis. Today, we're going to talk about them as part of steps 3 and 4, just because that's the structure of the conversation today. But I just want to highlight that we're still very much in deliberative mode and trying to make a determination about whether and how those might be appropriate to include. So as we go through today's conversation, I'd just like to, as we've done in the past, just encourage folks to raise their hands whenever a question arises. Try to make this as free-flowing a conversation as possible. And I certainly anticipate, as usual, Ray will be the first one to have his hand up, and I look forward to that. So as we move forward, let's talk about permit conditions. We can go to the next slide. And as with all of these conversations, we're going to start with the statute. That gives us our guidepost. That gives us our direction. And the statute provides that where a disproportionate impact exists, the department may apply conditions to a permit for the expansion of an existing facility or the renewal of an existing facility's major source permit, what we're calling just colloquially for today, Title V permits, concerning the construction and operation of the facility to protect public health. So that's where we get into situations of additional conditions to potentially reduce stressor impacts. So some of the questions that this obviously leads to, and I think first and primarily, and potentially a threshold question, is how does the department differentiate between new facilities, expanded facilities, and permit renewals? We've listed some examples on the screen just for conversational purposes and are looking for feedback on these examples. A new facility could be a newly sited facility. That seems fairly obvious, or a change in use to existing facility. So a change from one type of covered facility to another, or a non-covered facility to one that is subject to the environmental justice bill. That could be what we would consider and define as being a new facility. For expansions, we can be looking at expansions of the footprint of the facility. And we could be looking at increases in stressor contributions from the existing facility. So that could be potential increase in throughput that raises emissions. It could be increases in truck traffic due to increased business. We could consider those to be parts of an expansion definition. I think what's important to note here is that exemption at the bottom minor modifications to major source permits for activities or improvements that do not increase emissions is essentially an exception to that expansion rule. So if facility is operating under a major source permit and seeks to effectively upgrade its control technology or do some sort of other improvement to the facility that doesn't increase emissions, that is not in and of itself going to trigger a review under the environmental justice rule. And then I think we have to consider how we would define renewals. I think quite clearly that could be defined as just a continuation of existing operations. So certainly interested in folks who might have feedback there. Oh wow, Dan beat Ray. It's a good time to get to the first hand.
Sorry, Ray.
Good morning, Dan.
Good morning, Sean. Thank you for the opportunity to ask questions here. In the beginning of the section that triggers this review, it starts with notwithstanding the provisions of any law or rule or regulation adopted pursuant. So if the department changes a rule and increases a standard and requires a facility that is triggered under this to improve its pollution controls, discharge controls, whatever it may be, would that expansion of the treatment trigger an environmental justice review?
It's a good question. That's a situation where the facility is strictly upgrading control technologies to meet evolving regulatory standards? Is that what you're positing?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that kind of leads to a bit of a kind of dovetails a little bit with that second question I have. I mean, I don't think we have a specific determination on that yet. I think that it is fair for us to have a conversation about upgrades or changes to facilities that are done strictly for that purpose and whether that should be exempt from review. And I think that's something we'd certainly take under advisement. That's a good point.
Yeah, and just instead of raising my hand in the future, I mean, I guess the same type of thinking goes to the environmental benefit. When, for example, the CSO permits that are coming out, and I know the 4 facilities that under the wastewater plants that are triggered under this, all of those CSO plans are calling for expansion of treatment. That's a federal standard that's being met to eliminate the CSOs. And, the question would be, I'll ask it now, not looking for a response, but to log it, in that situation, would those types of improvements to meet environmental standards required by state or federal law, would they have to go through this as well? So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
No, those are good points. And there's certainly things that are on the front of our mind as we're trying to kind of sort out how all this process will work. I mean, I think we've talked about before, probably you and I, in one of these sessions, that the environmental justice. I don't think the environmental justice law is intended to make it more difficult to improve conditions in communities. And I think we have to consider those types of projects within that paradigm. And there'll probably be some nuances that we'll need to look at in terms of how those projects are done and what they are specifically done to do, and whether there are other increases in stressors that we might be concerned about. But I think as a general principle, a project that is going to relieve a stressor that's listed in the bill is probably a project that is fair to discuss whether it should or should not be subject to further review.
Thank you, Chair.
Absolutely.
Thank you. The next hand is Michael Trupin.
Hi, thank you so much. Just a quick question or just comment relative to this concept of expansion. It's important to note, and Sean, you brought up a couple of examples, and I realize they're just examples off the top of your head, but you talked about increased truck traffic due to increased business or increases in throughput at the facility. And I think it's going to be important for the rule to make sure that the rule takes consideration for what is currently permitted at the facility. And so from a potential to emit standpoint or from a potential operations standpoint, if the facility can handle a certain amount of business or a certain throughput, we wouldn't want increases that were within those potentials as described in their permit. We wouldn't want those increases to cause an EJ review. And so I think it's important that the concept of expansion consider what the potential is of the facility from from a permitting perspective or from a permit perspective, and also maybe even qualify that this obviously applies to things that require a modification of the existing permit.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I need to be more careful with my language, Michael. That's an excellent point. And the permit trigger that we've discussed previously would still apply here. So we wouldn't, it wouldn't be we're not going to create separate permit triggers. The law is pretty clear that if you're dealing with an existing permit, if you're seeking a new permit, those are the types of things where we would end up considering expansions. But thank you.
Thank you. The next hand is Ray Cantor.
Late to the party this morning, Ray.
Sorry, I'm off my game today. Just a couple of quick points. I think you're asking the right questions and on the right path. When we're talking about expansions or even the de minimis, dealing with minor air permits, and relating back a little to the last couple commenters, as well. The intent of the law is to prevent facilities from contributing to stresses, of these areas. I think it would make sense that you have not a very strict rule out there that any footprint expansion, is a trigger. If you look at the land use laws and the public access laws, in particular, one they'll give you some guidance as to, especially public access, as to what's new and change of use, and those type of things. Those rules seem to work, in practice. And, especially on the expansion side, you might want to have a de minimis, allowance. I don't think you want any 1 foot expansion to be able to trigger something. But if there were a 10% or whatever number it happens to be, or if those expansions, and again, you can look to other provisions. I think it's in 4A where it talks about conditions prior to your analysis. If whatever they're doing is actually resulting in a net decrease of emissions or a net decrease of stressors, maybe that shouldn't be considered to be, an expansion or triggering the rest of the review process. So there are lots of ways to get out of it by encouraging facilities to do the right things and to keep any activities that it does to a minimum threshold. You're encouraging behavior, encouraging reductions of stressors. You're limiting the ultimate burdens that may be put on the community. So I think you have a lot of flexibility in these definitions to not be overly prescriptive, but to encourage good behavior.
Thank you, Ray. I think Ray, I think your points are well taken, and I think you kind of are leading us right into that last question that's on the screen. There is, looking for feedback from folks on how we should treat those types of projects that could be considered an expansion, where they ultimately end in a reduction of emissions. And we can talk about that in a couple of different ways. We can talk about a reduction in direct air emissions, for example. We also have to talk about what are the ancillary, ultimately the ancillary effects of that reduction. So you bring in new control technology as part of an expansion of a facility that reduces your direct air emissions, but does your increase in throughput then kind of facility-wide basis increase emissions elsewhere? Does it increase emissions on your stationary sources that are not your direct air emissions? Does it increase your truck traffic? How should the department consider those? Should we be considering those on an individual stressor basis? Should we be taking more of, like Ray suggested, kind of a net reduction perspective or approach? And I think we'd be open to feedback on whether those facilities should be required to go through the rest of the environmental justice process through those additional requirements. So if folks have any feedback on that, give a little room for that before we move on to the next discussion. All right, we'll go to the next slide, but we can leave that there, folks. Folks have any thoughts as we move forward? Oh, we have a hand. Nope, we don't. Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how the department should approach permit conditions for renewals and expansions. So the first question, really more of a framing question, should the department consider the application of conditions on construction operations for expanded facilities or Title V renewals? How exactly should we do that? And it feeds into some of our sub questions. First, and this kind of talks or connects to what we talked about earlier as we were talking about what the through line through this is. Should avoidance, and if avoidance is not feasible, minimization of facility contributions to disproportionate stressors be a standard condition? And when we talk about Title V renewals, one of the questions we're looking at, one of the things we're considering is whether a standard such as best available control technology, which is kind of a federal standard, or state-of-the-art technology, state-of-the-art requirements, which are more of a state-specific standard, should that type of standard be imposed on new renewed Title V permits when they come in every 5 years, or on some longer time frame? Additionally, for situations where facility contributions can't be avoided, should we consider additional measures that it would improve baseline environmental or public health stressors in the host community? And that gets back to those things we talked about earlier. Require reductions of like stressors from offsite sources within the host community. So if the facility that is operating and is seeking to expand or renew will have some continued impact to particulate matter or to HAPs in a particular community, should we require, or I guess allow, for the reduction of that type of emissions from other sources within the community? Similarly, should we require or allow for reductions of other sources within the community? So other of those stressors that we've talked about, all of the things that we talked about last time. You have CSOs, and you have other mobile sources of air pollution. You have contaminated sites, transfer stations. Some of these things that are considered stressors, could conditions that are related to other stressors in the community be appropriate? And then third, should we require or allow applicants to deliver a net environmental benefit that improves baseline environmental and public health stressors in the community? And that would be kind of the provision of benefits as opposed to necessarily the reduction of stressors. And there's certainly some overlap there, but that could be a very open-ended thing that we'd certainly be looking for feedback on. And then if we're considering measures to reduce stressors elsewhere in the community, should the department consider reductions requiring stressors in order from their highest to lowest contribution? So if you were to take a snapshot of the stressor levels in the community, should we be looking at that in some sort of hierarchy and considering whether we should be asking facilities to reduce things that are at their highest levels, or should it be something that has more flexibility? And I think when we talk about those examples of essentially not direct facility reductions, I think the similar question applies, is whether that should be done in some level of a hierarchy, where an applicant would move through, say on a feasibility standard, through those different levels to see what they are able to do in a community before we get to something like a net environmental benefit. I'm hopeful people have thoughts on that. I'd love to hear them now. There we go.
Okay, Ray, the floor is yours.
Only because no one else was raising their hand, so I figured I would take up the dead airspace.
Thank you, sir.
We will send you in more specific suggestions. Again, just, we've obviously been thinking about this, but the questions you're asking could be fairly complicated, and the details are going to matter here.
Mhm.
When this bill was going through the legislature, one of our primary concerns, especially on renewals and expansions as well, is that while you cannot deny a permit, the ability to condition a permit could same as taxation, could equally destroy a facility and that business opportunity. It may sound nice to require backdoor, the latest control technologies, but for grandfathered facilities, they may be struggling to even stay in business doing what they're doing. So I think we always need to be conscious of cost and the impact that whatever conditions you put on that facility are going to have on the economic viability, of that facility. Even having said that, even when you consider that, again, we do live in a competitive environment where facilities, are owned by companies that have businesses across state lines. And if it becomes too expensive to do business in New Jersey, they're going to close the New Jersey location and move, or expand somewhere else, or move that facility. We know of one manufacturer who just recently moved from Trenton over to Pennsylvania because it was easy and cost effective to do that. Again, without getting into rhetoric, we know in the last 30 years, we've lost half our manufacturing base, 800,000 jobs to 400,000. This is not at all to say we cannot improve the conditions of neighborhoods and that we should. It's not to say that people or facilities should not be good neighbors and make improvements, but I just caution the department to be cautious, in this area, because you could very quickly make businesses go out of business, stop employing folks in those areas. And, I would make the argument that a good paying job, providing health benefits and everything else that, economic security brings to you is just as important to communities' health, to an individual's health and well-being, as is minuscule reductions in pollution load.
Thank you, Ray.
Thank you, Ray. The next hand is John Valeri.
Yes, hi, good morning. I
morning,
want to
John.
piggyback upon what Ray said. Hi, Sean. One of the things that I think it's an interesting thought about the renewal issue and the period of time of review. And one of the things I think you need to think about is the financing aspect of these facilities, particularly with respect to recently permitted, I'm going to say within the last 5 to 10 years, where a lot of these, and I can look at the power plant issues, but otherwise facilities that have had to put in best available control technology, and those being financed for 20, 30 years, whatever the amount may need to be. And even for new facilities where if they were to go through this process, use some sort of best, and staff to go and undergo best available control technology review, there's still a consideration as to whether, if it's financed 5 years later, there's going to be another consideration because of the analysis on it being a stressor and what the department may impose. I know you can't change the permitting cycle, that's in statute, but one of the things the department's I think is going to need to consider in maybe either having a longer period of time look for review is the fact that this could have a very negative impact on financing of existing and newer facilities because it adds an unknown every 5 years in the permit cycle as to whether, even if we did the best, whether that remains the best in another permit cycle. So I would strongly encourage the consideration of the when a stressor was installed, because everything is in stressor, and for whether it's existing or for a new facility, because you may impact the financing on that facility and also the ability to get financing going forward for facilities that you may want, which are environmentally beneficial.
So, John, when you're talking about the financing, is the financing connected to the fact that the technology is considered the best at the time, or is it just that there's additional uncertainty because of the potential for additional costs to be added in 5 years?
It's the latter. That's
okay.
correct. To me, it's the latter, and it's why, quite frankly, there was always talk of federally, although it never went anywhere, of having permits not be 5 years, but every 10 years or whatever, because it would match what people invest in. Obviously, that's not the case. But with respect to EJ specifically, that just becomes an additional unknown that needs to be. Now, I'm not saying financing is going to stop. I don't want to say, but my point is it adds another uncertainty, and that could be a driver on whether something gets financed. If I have a project that's environmentally beneficial, do I want to invest in that? Because I'm not sure if it will be still considered environmentally beneficial 5 years from now when I renew, and maybe the BACT is tweaked or whatever the standard you're going to use. And now I'm imposed something else which adds cost, which may require additional financing. So that's why I think it's a good idea to consider longer periods of time. I don't have that for you, but I think it's something that needs to be considered.
Okay. Thank you, John. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
We have a few hands up, and thank you, John. The next is Kathy French.
Thank you. Appreciate you guys doing this. Want to follow up on comments from both Ray and John. First, in addition to losing the jobs, there's also the problem of if facilities move, you're losing that tax base, which normally can be rather significant. And so for an economically depressed area or a challenged area, those communities are then losing significant tax dollars, which is also going to hurt the public services available to them. I'm very concerned on the Title V renewals about using BACT or state of the art. Those have got long litigation histories. Environmental groups know how to exploit them. And so giving us a standard or a requirement that is going to give them another potential ability for litigation in the potential renewal of our Title V permit, to add to the thought of, oh, my Title V permit renewal, you're going to include BACT in that, and NGOs are going to litigate that evaluation of BACT all over again. I've got, $500,000 of litigation costs every 5 years. That's going to make a bank's consideration of, are we willing to risk your air permit because it's got the potential for litigation over, BACT litigations are horrible to go through, as you probably well know. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you. Next is Catherine Ward.
Hi, Olivia. Hi, Sean. Thanks so much.
Good morning.
So listening to the comments that have been made and certainly understanding them, representing industry as well, like I do, the big thing I think is predictability. And that's what everything that we've heard so far today has been about how to predict what the outcome is going to be, not just from a permitting standpoint, but from a financing standpoint and looking down the road, even perhaps from a litigation standpoint. So I guess my comment comes from the perspective of how is the department going to structure this process by which it makes these decisions based on the examples and the situations that are in the slide. So, for example, will it be more objective? And will there be a series of points given for proposals that might reduce one stressor while it might increase another? Will their points be given to something that will have a more lasting benefit than something that has like an immediate benefit, rather than having a more subjective weighing that goes on? Because I think we all realize that every single permit application is going to be unique in a certain way. So can there be a way to put this within a program so that a consultant standing back before any application is made can give his client a reasonable expectation for what the outcome of the process will be, and therefore address the issues that the other commenters today have raised? So that was my comment. It was really more from a process standpoint. So thank you.
Yeah, I think we'll talk more. We'll talk a little bit more in depth with process in a month or so from now. I think when we talk about state of the art or BACT, I think one of the reasons why that is potentially interesting to the department is that it is an existing standard that could be applied consistently to Title V renewals, where it might provide, taking certainly into account the comments we previously heard, about the litigation risks, something that is existing regulatory and understood in the industry might be, frankly, more objective and more reasonable for folks to be able to deal with than a more narrative standard that requires generally kind of a maximum reduction of emissions. I think that's part of the balance and dance we're trying to do here, is to find the right standards and the right conditions and, frankly, the right terminology. But Kathy, I don't know if you have any feedback on that. It looked like I might have cut you off.
No, I think that the fact that you're thinking along those terms is great, because again, the more that we can define in an objective manner with a known outcome up front, the better. But you have a lot of weighing to do that has to be reflected in that process. So I guess I'm more curious to see what the framework is going to be, that the department's going to come up with. I think the fine tuning of that framework is going to be very key.
Agreed. Thank you. And I certainly think it does bear repeating. Our goal here is for as much of this to be as clear and objective as possible. There are going to be areas where there are going to have to be some subjective decisions made as you look at the bill and think about how this process will play out. I think we'd like to minimize the subjectivity as much as possible and make this clear and workable. So we're certainly on the same page there. Whether we get to a place where it is objective enough for folks will remain to be seen.
Understood. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Next is Toby Hanna.
Hi, Olivia. Thank you. Hi, Sean. Good to see you guys again.
You as well.
I was late today. I was actually doing a panel session for a group of attorneys on environmental justice rulemaking. So, I'll go back at the other slides and see if I have any other comment to help you on those as well. But I tuned in right when we jumped on this slide, Sean, and I might need more time, Olivia. I know we have time limits, but this one's got a lot on it, and I'll go through quickly, but happy to have any follow-up questions from you guys that would be helpful. And I think I have a little bit on each of your bullets that hopefully will be helpful. On the first one, and how we look at public health protection, particularly in Title V renewals, that there's a traditional process to that is health risk based usually. And the second bullet talks about best available control technology, but usually the stressors that we're talking about are air toxics. And that's more of a health risk analysis than it is a control technology analysis. Really, you're trying to minimize the health risk. And sometimes that does involve new control technologies, but it's not driven to best available. It's really driven to lowest achievable health risk. And again, that's a process that's well baked into the AIR program right now and can be used here. And I guess, the balance is you're looking to bring in cumulative impacts to that as well of other stressors in addition to the air toxics. How you layer that into an air permit is certainly, maybe that's a bigger question in another slide, but is a real challenge. Bringing in non-air media, right? Bringing in noise or waste or water as other environmental stressors into a Title V renewal. I can't begin to know how you would take that on, but and then also bringing in other contributors outside of that Title V's facility is another factor of how do you blend all that together? But jumping down to your other bullets, I think you get to some of that and to contemplate how that might work just a little bit would be. If you can't avoid it at the facility, can you create reductions in other places in the community that would make up for it? I think that's certainly something we would want to have the flexibility to look at. I don't know that could be mandated, but I look at that as being part of a negotiated process that, we want to make some reductions. Hey, this is a better economic value for public health than trying to retrofit something in our own operations. So we can give you something in the community, but it might not be inside our fence line. But those, if you guys have been in fur long enough to know that they're not around every corner. Sometimes you get a needle in a haystack, and there's a real gem out there that you can count on. But other times it's forced, and you may not be able to do it. So I can't see that being a mandate necessarily, but it would certainly be, I think, a welcome flexibility to have. And that type of activity could certainly be a condition in a Title V renewal, if we're talking about Title V renewals, to create that benefit. We've done that in enforcement actions in the past. Supplemental environmental projects are kind of where my head goes for that type of thinking, and sometimes those are baked into legal agreements, either enforcement agreements or permit conditions. But again, I think prioritizing those in your last bullet about whether you would look at spreading those from highest to lowest contributors, you'd certainly want to prioritize them. I just think about economic and the cost effectiveness really is how much reduction, how much improvement, how much public health protection are you getting for your dollar? Let's take the one that's getting the most public benefit for the dollar. And that again is kind of a negotiation that you end up with here. The trick with the negotiation, though, and this is my last point, is that it's got to be streamlined enough. It's got to be predictable, because that can go on forever, and nobody has forever to get through these things, neither the public nor the regulated facility. That's it. I'm happy to take any questions back on my ramble, though.
It was a good ramble. Give us some stuff to think about, Toby. Thank you. As always, I was hoping you'd be here for this particular slide, so you came at just the right time.
Yes, yeah, thanks.
Absolutely. So thank you for your contribution as always.
Yes, thank you, Toby. Next, Ray Cantor.
Again, just really quick, was I noticed that this slide has emphasis on reduction of stressors in the community. While good, this is not necessarily a health-based law. This is a stressor comparison type of law. So I think you should definitely also ensure, and going back to the report of, furthering the promise, that we talk about the possible creation of environmental and public health benefits, as ways to use conditions for these facilities. So it's not always just about creating or eliminating stressors. Sometimes it's about creating good things in communities that improve the quality of life, because this is really a quality of life law. So again, let's talk about the good things and how facilities can also improve, again, quality of life in areas, as opposed to just eliminating stressors which may or may not have any impact, on their health.
Thank you, Ray. Yeah, I think at least that concept is what we're attempting to touch on in that third example there, is how the department should approach that, whether it's appropriate for inclusion in any fashion. But also, frankly, wanting to ensure that facilities operating are doing everything that they can. And we'll discuss further what can means. There's feasibility, there's cost, there's a lot of different things that go to that, but doing everything that they reasonably can to reduce as directly as possible the stressors that are affecting these communities. I think the bill contemplates that as being as important to quality of life as anything else. So I think we really have to address that head on. And I think that's why we're trying to have a broad conversation about the different ways to get there and how we should consider them, and potentially how they should be ordered in any type of analysis. So fair points.
Yeah. Thank you, Ray. And so we're going to take this last hand for now, and then I think we need to start progressing a little bit more through the slides. So Michael Troupin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I know that a number of folks have talked about this concept of, especially for the Title V renewals, but even for modifications, you bring up, should BACT or state of the art be imposed, and so I know we've kind of beat that up quite a bit, and I'm wondering if maybe a different approach, consistent with something that the Bureau of Stationary Resources currently does, whether or not that could potentially be beneficial in this situation, and that would be not necessarily putting in regulation concepts tying this process, this EJ process, back to either backed or state-of-the-art type of review, but instead utilizing something similar to what goes on from a toxics perspective. And there is, while you're evaluating risk for toxic emissions, HAP emissions from a project, if you determine that the risk cannot be made to be negligible, the department has a group, a team that is formed to discuss that risk and to discuss with the facility certain measures that can be taken, whether that's certain pollution prevention control measures, or I should say pollution prevention measures, whether that is control technology, whether that is reevaluating emission rates, potential emission rates, but more of a dialogue and discussion-based approach to figuring out, in this case, a non-negligible risk situation, rather than prescribing technologies or concepts like state-of-the-art or backed, moving more towards a committee and dialogue type of approach to the situation.
Thank you, Michael. All right, this is really good, excellent stuff. Thank you, everyone. All right, let's move on to the discussion of compelling public interest. Again, back to where we start, which each of these, the statute, and just to remind ourselves as well as everyone else, what the statute says about this. Where disproportionate impact exists for a new facility, the statute provides that the department shall deny that permit, except where the department determines that the new facility will serve a compelling public interest in the community. Again, I'm continuing to hammer home that very, very key language there, which is in the community. And then in that situation, we can grant a permit that imposes conditions on the construction and operation of the facility to protect public health. So I think there's going to be some overlap here in terms of how we discuss conditions, but it certainly is a bit of a different scenario when we're talking about new facilities. We're not talking about existing facilities. We're not talking about a limited authority. The department has a different level of authority here when we're dealing with new facilities. So we're going to kind of run through these concepts again, ask some different questions, but there will be some overlap. I'm going to go to the next slide. So kind of that first question, our framing question is how should the department consider whether a facility will serve a compelling public interest in the community where it's proposed to be located? We're certainly examining existing regulatory language, trying to see whether and how that might be appropriate to be adapted to this type of analysis. It exists in some of our underlying watershed land management rules, particularly freshwater wetlands, where the term compelling public interest and compelling public need is used elsewhere. So we certainly have some facility with this. I think our goal here is to provide as clear and objective a standard as possible, but recognizing that compelling public interest is by its nature a somewhat subjective analysis and ultimately a decision for the commissioner to make on individual permit applications. But as we get into this, I think it keys up a couple of kind of preliminary questions for us to talk about, and those are the ones you see on the screen there. The bottom three. First, should we require a consideration of alternatives to citing in an OBC when considering a compelling public interest? Beyond citing, should there be a consideration of alternatives in design that could be less impactful, or operations? And I think this gets back to actually some of the things that Michael Troupin was just talking about, control technology, emission rates, some of the things that a facility might propose to do that could in some way keep any of its emissions at the lowest possible level for consideration of compelling public interest. And I think then that dovetails pretty nicely into some other high level questions that we need to ask ourselves. And that's really, are there specific projects or impacts that should not be considered in a compelling public interest analysis? So things that really just be effectively off the table. Are there certain facilities that shouldn't be eligible to even apply for this type of flexibility? Because it is flexibility. And I think then the second thing we would, I reverse them. The second thing we would ask ourselves is, are there particular facilities that it is appropriate to consider compelling public interest? Are there things that that folks would want to urge us to consider to be beneficial to the community in and of themselves? And how should we approach that? So certainly interested in feedback on any of those questions. Excellent. We have D. Palmer.
Hi, it's Dennis Palmer, Land Usage Authority and AEA.
Hey, Dennis.
We have other laws that have directed food waste to go to wastewater treatment plants, and in turn trying to turn that into methane to be used in cogeneration and provide for resiliency. That's something I think we should have as a project consider compelling public interest, as well as any kind of cogeneration or microgrids that help for resiliency. We have another storm. And with respect to any wastewater facilities or any kind of facility utilities that need a CAFRA permit, and in turn that CAFRA permit is for, again, resiliency, hardening for storms, to resist the flooding or other similar projects.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think we certainly anticipated from folks that that part of this conversation would be about these environmentally beneficial facilities. I think we just have to keep reminding ourselves of that key language in the legislation, but in the community, and need to be cognizant of how these particular facilities, as broadly beneficial as they might be, would connect to those residents in those facilities and how we look at that. And we'll get into some more conversation about how we might analyze that. Danielle Waterfield.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
So I thought I would just comment here. The state of New Jersey has a deep history of supporting recycling as a benefit to the environment and public health. In fact, there's an FAQ document on NJDEP's website to this fact. ISRI wants to emphasize today just that there really needs to be a need for the EJ regulations to be consistent with the existing New Jersey statutes that recognize the benefits of recycling. The actions of New Jersey courts and the legislature over the years clearly support the position that recycling is a public interest. And I know your focus is specifically in our communities. Well, recently, New Jersey Lieutenant Governor Oliver discussed her commitments to the state's green economy and the cleaner environment. And one key contributor to this is recycling. Strong recycling programs reflect a community's commitment to a cleaner environment, and it contributes to healthy and united communities. So with this involved, it's important that everyone remembers, however, that the collection of materials alone is not recycling. To achieve the state's numerous recycling goals, and there's even more in the legislature right now pending, we must transform the materials to achieve the environmental and public health savings from recycling. And that happens within the facilities within our community. We've submitted more about some of this in our written comments in December, so we can look at that and love to follow up with you on it. But what I wanted to point out today is just that what we can't understand is why the EJ law seems to focus on recycling and scrap recycling facilities as a potential detriment to the environment, or more specifically as an environmental or public health stressor, as we talked about at the last public hearing, when clearly, for example, the facts show recycling materials and using them in the manufacturing sector as opposed to virgin materials results in a net reduction for major categories of air pollutants. And our communities benefit from recycling for numerous other purposes. We employ them. We also engage again in the community involvement. We are in our schools. We have definite community benefits. And so we believe that the implementation of the environmental justice law should recognize the clear benefits of recycling in a way that the regulations are also consistent with the New Jersey's other statutes that recognize the benefits of recycling. And as a compelling interest, we would welcome the opportunity to discuss with your department how these different programs and opportunities coexist and how it can work together with the goals of the environmental justice law.
Thank you, Danielle. We'll take you up on that offer when we get through some more of the stakeholder, and certainly understand we need to have an in-depth and direct discussion with the recycling industry about this issue. I mean, the bill reflects that certain facilities, solid waste facilities and other things, including recycling facilities, bring levels of stressors to these communities. I from the department's perspective, our intent is not to in any way demonize those facilities or to underplay the benefits that those facilities bring to us as a state. I think the question that we need to answer and the thing that we are we are seeking to address with the environmental justice law and the underlying regulations is the abundance of facilities in these communities, right? It is about a lot about siting. It's about improving quality of life through I think, better operations and better siting decisions. So it is really a question of whether, when we talk about these new facilities, when we talk about compelling public interest, is whether, whether more recycling facilities should be put in these communities, or whether they should go elsewhere. And I think that's part of the conversation that we want to have with you and generally, and what we really want to accomplish in this bill is not to undermine our very, very important environmental goals with regard to recycling, but potentially, having the state more as a whole share some of that perceived burden as a result of the stressors. And that can be from a lot of things that are just inherent in their operations, right? It's inherent in the operation of the equipment. It's inherent in the delivery and removal of materials that are required to make these things happen. And I think that's really what it comes down to. So I really do appreciate your comments. Very, very, very thoughtful and very, very
Excellent.
welcome. So thank you.
We welcome the opportunity to talk with you about it.
Excellent. Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you, Danielle. Now we have a hand from Toby Hanna.
Yeah, thanks again, guys. I think I have just two thoughts here. One of them maybe is a question for you, if that's okay. But let's start with the comment on alternative design, alternative siting. Typically my experience is that happens before applications are submitted, right? That's an analysis that is done by the company. If it's a big project that involves the municipality, local groups, other stakeholders, and those choices are made for all reasons, just to overall to optimize the impact of the project in general. So that the siting, I guess my point is the siting analysis happens upstream of where we would be getting to with an environmental justice impact statement and public hearing process. So revisiting it at that stage to me is after the fact, and it's redundant when ideally that those stakeholders are engaged early on in those early decisions before designs are made, before applications are filed. Does that resonate with you guys at all, or am I thinking about it incorrectly?
No, I don't. So I think that this bill and these rules will inform those early planning decisions. I would hope they would inform those early planning decisions. Right now, if a new facility is seeking to be cited in OBC, we aim to make that information as readily and easily available for folks as you're planning a new facility, so that you can then consider those things. I think that what I draw from your comment is when you're looking at siting, there is a reason that the facility is seeking to be cited in a particular OBC, right? And I think the alternatives analysis has to get into the details of why that decision is being proposed, right? Is there a specific reason why a new wastewater treatment plant needs to be located in OBC because of its proximity to some other part of the overall waste management process that requires to be cited there? I think that's the type of thing that we would be looking to understand as part of a siting alternatives analysis, because I think too often it's just frankly has been easier to cite in OBCs, right? Because they have less political people in the communities have less political power. The land is potentially less expensive. There are a lot of specific economic reasons why these facilities have ended up where they've ended up. I think part of what the bill intends to do is to even out those economic considerations, even out some of those permitting considerations, so that we're on more of a level playing field with non-OBCs. But there might be reasons, and I think what we'd aim to get to in an alternatives analysis are there specific reasons why this needs to be there, why it needs to be there, why it serves the interest of the folks in the community for it to do so. So if someone's planning a project right now before these rules exist, I certainly can understand why they would not be thinking in this vein. But as we're moving forward with these rules, I would expect folks to, us generally to start thinking about it a slightly different way and try to, and have to make some, frankly, probably more difficult decisions. But the compelling public interest is there to allow for those situations where there is a need. We just need to figure out the best way to address that need and the best way to address the ultimately the benefits for the communities.
Yeah, I think that's well said, Sean. And I think it's my point. Yeah, that if this is influencing those decisions at their decision point, which is upstream of submitting applications, submitting your EJIS, and doing a public hearing. We don't want surprises at that point. There's a lot at stake there, but it should be influencing. And you're right, with the people that I know that are making those design decisions and those siting choices, they're sure as heck looking at this now and thinking about, whether it's going to work or not, or how it's going to change things. Yeah,
exactly. And I would expect, when a facility comes to an EJIS process, comes to the public hearing, they would have considered all those things that we just talked about and would come with a presentation to the community that says, these are the things we've thought about. This is why we think we need to be here. This is how we benefit you. This is why, even though we may have these types of contributions to the existing stressors, we think that this serves a compelling public interest if you're at that point of the process, right? So I think it's a matter of our thinking collectively, both industry, department, and in the communities evolving, so that we're all on the same page and acting in accordance with what the rules will set out.
Okay. My last, maybe it's a question for you on this point, was just in terms of defining compelling public interest, we don't have a list of attributes yet. Is that what you're looking to build? And that what criteria, what different, we've talked about some obviously already, but public health, tax base, jobs, other things that are factors there. Is that something that you need input on? Is that something you want to propose to us? How will that work?
Ideally, we'll get input today and in the period after this meeting, where folks have an opportunity to digest a bit more of this and give us some ideas of what those criteria should be, so that when we speak to you again in probably a month and change or 2 months from now, we'll have a definition that will then with our input and our consideration kind of pull together all that we've heard and try to lay out what those criteria should be. So that is really the goal.
I think that'd be a great question on you're going to do a survey, post meeting survey like you've done on the others. If that's one of the questions, that would be a good, fill in the blank with what you think should be on that list. Okay.
That's a good point. Thank you, Toby.
Good deal. Really. Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Toby. Next is Dan Kennedy.
Thank you, Olivia. I just want to raise this issue, the fact that from a siting perspective, you could also have generations of planning and zoning at the local level that allows for and encourages and actually state incentives that incentivize these uses in these places. So DEP is one layer of this, but you also, I chair my local planning board. You can't forget that the locals who control planning and zoning could for generations have not only allowed for these uses, encourage them, but incentivize them with tax credits and other benefits. So I think that applicants should be able to use that as part of their decision making in terms of explaining to the department and the community why they're choosing to locate in certain places. So I just felt that needed to be said. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. All right. Sorry. I'm used to more questions. I was taking notes. Okay. Thank you. We can go to the next slide. We'll continue this on. Okay. So this again goes to that conversation that we've kind of had already, but puts it in this context, the conversation of avoidance and ultimately minimization of impacts. So, the first question we've asked ourselves is, when attempting to demonstrate that a facility will serve a compelling public interest in a host community, should the minimization of contributions to disproportionate stressors be a requirement? And I think kind of, potentially a threshold requirement. Following that line of thinking, where a facility cannot avoid those contributions, should the department, in one instance, we could simply consider whether the facility itself serves a compelling public interest in the community, such as serves environmental, public health, or a safety need in the community. This kind of things that we've been kind of talking about already. I think the second question we can ask ourselves is whether it would be appropriate to think a little bit more broadly in that concept of what it means for a facility to serve a compelling public interest in the community. And that could be the provision of additional measures that would reduce or improve baseline environmental and public health stressors, and some of the stuff we've already kind of run through in the hierarchy before, but reductions of like stressors from offsite sources in the host community, reductions of other stressors from offsite sources in the community, so things that the facility is maybe not directly contributing to, but are otherwise stressors of concern within a particular community, or net environmental benefits that will ultimately improve those baseline public health and public health and environmental stressors. And those could be things that we've talked about in our prior conversations. Lack of environmental benefits. We've also talked about broader social stressors that can contribute to some of our public health concerns that are identified in the bill. That last category is potentially very broad and something that we need to ensure that's not too broad, but we certainly want to have a conversation about whether and how folks would encourage us to approach that, the types of things that they think we need to be looking at in that vein. So I'll just pause for a couple seconds, see if any hands want to go up, and otherwise we're getting close to the end. We have one more substantive slide before we do more of an open Q&A. So I don't know if folks have any input on this type of analysis and how or whether it would be appropriate. Okay, let's go to the last slide, and then we'll do our kind of button-up Q&A at the end. And I think that's probably reflective of the fact that we've discussed some of these things already. So I don't want to, not just going to stare into the silence. So this is kind of the last piece to cover here. I think that one of the key aspects of the bill, obviously, is public participation and some level of self-determination for individuals in these communities that are considered overburdened throughout our state. And when we're considering public interest or compelling public interest, I think that public interest part in the community is obviously extremely important and something we need to focus on. So part of the question we need to ask ourselves and are asking ourselves, and we need feedback on from folks, is how should we consider the interest of the individuals in the host community when a proposed project is ultimately contending that it will serve a compelling public interest. It gets into questions of community concurrence. If the community concurs that a project is providing a benefit, would that be sufficient to establish a compelling public interest? And then I think the obvious question from there is how does the department best suited to ensure an accurate assessment of community concurrence? And again, community being a very finely defined term within the bill. We're talking about census block groups. So we're talking about folks in neighborhoods or smaller groups of neighborhoods who are being affected by stressors, and how are we best served to gauge their positions on these particular projects so that they are given the voice that the environmental justice law demands that they have. So I don't know if this is anything that that folks in this particular meeting have input on, but it's certainly something that that we're working to address and would have more specific proposals on in the coming months. But if anyone is interested in helping to inform those proposals, now would be a good time to let us know. Obviously, we'll take questions after this and comments after this as we move forward, potentially through a survey or otherwise. So that is basically our last substantive slide. And so with those questions out there, or anyone else who wants to raise things that we haven't specifically covered, make any types of final statements, now would be your opportunity to raise your hand for one last time before we bid you adieu for this wonderful early April day.
Okay, Toby, floor is yours.
Thank you, Olivia. On the last slide, Sean, the question about, I saw the challenge of how would we judge concurrence. And I would suggest certainly if there's existing community advisory panel or active meaningful engagement already with the community and that facility or group of facilities, that they be the judge If they're satisfied and there's not significant objectors beyond that, that's a pretty good voice. I think it also sends the incentive out there for that kind of meaningful engagement, which happens for most companies at some level, and a lot are thinking about building on those in a bigger way now, certainly. So you could continue that momentum, I think, with the right policy direction there.
Yeah, I mean, very much agree with that. I think that that engagement will be baked into the EJIS process, and I think we're hopeful that that facilities and companies will want to build on the minimum requirements there, and want to talk to communities in advance and really kind of work with communities to find ways to make these projects, if they want to pursue them, make them work for both the applicant and the members of the community. And we'll certainly have some requirements in our EJIS process to address that, but definitely hopeful that the sense of kind of corporate responsibility and good neighborship will take over under these regulations. And we certainly our goal is to put some accountability to that through permitting and other things, and get us all on the same page. So thank you, Toby.
Thank you, Toby. Next, Ray Cantor.
Thank you, Olivia. And I just want to thank you and Sean again for putting together a very well thought out and excellent stakeholder meeting. Hopefully this will end up being a much better informed and workable rule as a result of all the work you're both are doing. So we appreciate those efforts. Just a small, a clarification just to make sure we're all on the same page. We're talking about siting before and some of the pre-decisional concepts that an applicant will go through as to determine where to put a facility. Since the ultimate denial or conditioning is based on a comparative analysis, I'm assuming based on earlier conversations, if there is a map out there that lists out stressors, an applicant will know, even if it's an overburdened community, that certain overburdened communities are not disproportionate and certain ones are. And and it may be easier to steer them to overburdened communities that aren't overly not disproportionately impacted. So just because you're overburdened community does not mean you cannot go there. It's really the comparative that throws you into the denial or the condition stage. Just for that clarification.
Yeah, and I think that's, sorry, can I just, do you mind, Ray?
No, go ahead.
But that's
Don't
that
take my
step
2 minutes away, but go ahead.
I will not. We will pause your time. You will get more. That's really where that step one comes through, where we're talking about, having that publicly available information, having those stressor levels out there, so everyone can take a look at a particular address and make a determination of what are the comparative stressor levels at that location, and what if I want to locate my business there, what am I going to have to deal with? And I think if the more of that information we provide up front, I think this is going to become a lot easier for everyone, because those decisions will be as informed as they can be before we even get into an EJIS process. Now you can have your time back.
Thank you. I appreciate that. On the issue of compelling public interest, I think it might be helpful, again, if you look at some of the economic benefits that certain facilities may have in communities. It was mentioned tax base before, but I'll emphasize again, good paying jobs in a community, economic progress in a community are as beneficial as anything else you could bring to that community. So I think that should not be excluded from your analysis of what a compelling public need, is in a community. And I could see as well, maybe I'll take a former example. If we want to bring back, well, we are a good state in farmer research, and farmer research facilities often may have Title V facilities attached to them. And if we want to bring those types of high-level paying and good research jobs into our cities again, into Newark again, which may fall on the opposite side of that area, I think we should do what we can to encourage those types of businesses in particular from coming in, and not discourage them just because they fall within the technical definitions or the definitions of a facility under this bill, and they are a stressor. They do have lots of benefits. We should not be discouraging high-paying, really good jobs coming into communities that really need those high-paying, really good jobs. So again, just something you should be considering. And I know the law talks about compelling public benefit in the community, but if you're going to narrow it just to that neighborhood, you may never get to that point in time where you're going to be able to show that. I think you do need to take maybe a little bit more globalistic viewpoint of what that community is and what those benefits are. If a wastewater facility pipe is going through an area and it's opening up development and benefits in other parts of the area and really providing good economic tax base overall for that city, for that locality, to say that that pipe is going through a community that does not benefit them is going to stop an awful lot of things from happening, because it's hard to show compelling public interest in a particular neighborhood from at least those types of development. So I would just encourage you to take a little bit broader viewpoint than a strict neighborhood by neighborhood type of compelling public need analysis. Again, thank you both.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ray. We have a hand from John Valeri.
Yes, thank you. Just really one on the issue of determining public need locally. I think we can't forget that many mayors and councils will enact a resolution supporting the development of a project. I mean, they are the most local elected body, at least in most areas, of representing the community. And I think there needs to be some consideration when a local governing body supports a project that should be considered as part of the determination of compelling public need. They're also subject to election, so that's why I think it's an appropriate measurement of need. The other issue I wanted to raise is on 2 slides ago, and I was thinking about it as the slides were switching. You were talking about off-site benefits. I suspect, I've gone through supplemental environmental projects. They typically deal with projects that aren't maybe as complex as I am considering you guys may go with respect to providing off-site benefits in lieu of on-site. And the concern I would raise is, for example, if you're in a city where you have a project and you may want to work with a utility authority on developing or helping them out, you end up in this long, protracted negotiation where it may be held over you. And so I guess, I am curious how you develop that sort of off-site analysis, because it could also impact the ability of a permit being issued, depending upon, and forgive me, whether some of these entities decide they're going to use that to extract. I hate to say it that way, particularly in situations where maybe the department wants some of these entities to improve their environmental conditions, and yet some of these entities may push back for more. So I just raised that as a concern. Maybe at some point we'll get more detail on what offsite may mean. But again, if it's planting trees in a park, that's one thing. I suspect you're going farther. If you're getting into large, protracted negotiations, those can be just as burdensome. So I just want to raise that concern.
Thanks, John. And I will guarantee you we'll have more on what that might look like if it becomes part of this conversation. But that's good feedback, and thank you. All right. Well, I'm done. Olivia, anything else you want to say? I'll just say thank you again to everyone for joining us today, for the always excellent feedback, and look forward to talking to you again in a month.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to echo the thanks for all the wonderful feedback we received and the great number of participants we had today. I think we were up to 116 participants, so that was really great. And I definitely want to give my colleague, Sean Moriarty, incredible kudos for facilitating today's meeting, and also recognize the team that stands behind us to make sure that we're prepared. We're the face of these conversations, but it is definitely an entire team effort that helps to prepare us for this. So we thank you all. We thank our team, and Sean, I thank you. And
Thank you, Olivia. Can't echo that more. Thank you, everybody.